During decades, the military archives kept this story in total secrecy. None of the Marines who participated wanted to talk about what really happened that night at Mount Suribachi. But today, you're going to discover why. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The photographs show them with stern faces, strong, determined young men in crisp Marine uniforms, standing at attention in the sweltering heat of Montford Point, North Carolina. It was 1942, and for the first time in 167 years of United States Marine Corps history, African-American recruits were being accepted into its ranks. Among them stood Private First Class Marcus Johnson, 22 years old, former college student from Detroit, Michigan. His eyes betrayed no emotion, but his letters home told a different story. "They don't want us here," he wrote to his mother in August of 1942. "The white officers make that clear every day, but we are going to show them what we can do. We have to. There's no going back now." Johnson was among the first wave of recruits to train at Montford Point, a segregated facility hastily constructed on the edges of Camp Lejeune. The barracks were unfinished when they arrived. The grounds were infested with snakes and mosquitoes, and the training regime was deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of men who had already endured a lifetime of prejudice. Colonel Samuel A. Woods, a career Marine from South Carolina, commanded the camp with an iron fist. His directive from Marine Corps headquarters was clear: train these men, but ensure they understand their place. Black Marines would serve in support roles only: ammunition handlers, depot workers, stewards. Combat was reserved for white Marines. This was official policy, written into the training manuals and reinforced through daily humiliations. "We had a drill instructor named Sergeant Thomas," recalled Sergeant William Goines in an interview conducted in 1967. "First day of training, he gathered us around and said, 'The commandant doesn't want you here. I don't want you here. But you're here, so I'm going to make Marines out of you if it kills you.' And then he tried his best to do just that." By December of 1943, approximately 7,000 African Americans had completed basic training at Montford Point. Most were assigned to ammunition and depot companies: the 8th Ammunition Company, the 36th Depot Company, the 19th Depot Company, units designed to handle supplies, transport ammunition, and support the main combat forces in the Pacific Theater. None were expected to engage directly with Japanese forces. Private Johnson was assigned to the 8th Ammunition Company under the command of Captain Arthur Whitaker, a white officer from Virginia. Johnson's letters home grew less frequent as 1944 approached. The few that did arrive mentioned intensive training in ammunition handling, vehicle operation, and, unexpectedly, combat techniques taught in secret by black non-commissioned officers who believed their men would need these skills, regardless of official policy. "Sergeant Davis makes us practice firing positions after lights out," Johnson wrote in January of 1944. "Says we'll need to know how to use a rifle when the time comes, no matter what the brass tells us. I believe him." In February of 1944, the 8th Ammunition Company received orders to deploy to the Pacific. They boarded the USS Winged Arrow at San Diego Naval Base on February 14th, joining a massive convoy headed for the Marshall Islands. The men were segregated even at sea, confined to separate quarters from white Marines, eating at different times, and restricted from most areas of the ship. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Henderson, the convoy commander, made his expectations clear in a briefing to all officers. "The colored Marines are to remain in support roles at all times. Under no circumstances are they to engage in direct combat with enemy forces. They are not equipped for it, nor are they expected to perform in that capacity." Captain Whitaker nodded in agreement during the briefing. Later, however, he gathered his black non-commissioned officers and shared a different message. According to Sergeant Howard Williams' personal diary, recovered after the war, Whitaker told them, I don't know what we're heading into, but I know this. Every Marine in my company will be prepared to fight. Train your men accordingly, but keep it quiet. The convoy reached Eniwetok Atoll on March 3, 1944. The 8th Ammunition Company established operations on the recently captured island, supporting Marine and Army units as they prepared for the next phase of the island-hopping campaign. It was here that Private Johnson and his fellow Marines had their first encounter with the realities of the Pacific War. The Japanese had been driven off the island weeks before we arrived, Johnson wrote in a letter that would be delivered posthumously to his family. But they left their dead behind. The smell is something I cannot describe. White Marines look at us like we're nothing, but death doesn't care what color you are. It smells the same on everyone. For the next several months, the 8th Ammunition Company moved from island to island across the Pacific, always in support of the main combat forces, always behind the front lines, at least in theory. In practice, the fluid nature of the Pacific campaign meant that front lines often did not exist in any meaningful sense. Japanese forces would hide in caves and dense jungle, emerging to attack supply lines and support units when least expected. On Saipan in June of 1944, the men of the 19th Depot Company found themselves under direct attack when Japanese soldiers infiltrated behind American lines. The official after-action report, declassified in 1962, stated only, "Elements of support units engaged with enemy forces. Situation resolved with minimal casualties." What the report failed to mention was that these support units were Black Marines who had never been trained or equipped for combat. Lieutenant James Harris, a white officer attached to the 5th Marine Division, witnessed the engagement. In an oral history recorded in 1959, he described what he saw. Those colored boys from the Depot Company had no business being in that fight. But when the Japanese came through that valley, they had no choice. What surprised me wasn't that they fought. They had to fight or die. What surprised me was how well they fought. Organized, disciplined, effective, like they'd been training for it their whole lives, which in a way, I suppose they had been. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical phase. American forces were preparing to assault islands ever closer to the Japanese homeland. Each step brought fiercer resistance, and the human cost was mounting. The 5th Amphibious Corps, comprising the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, was preparing for what would become one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific Campaign. The assault on Iwo Jima. The 8th Ammunition Company, including Private First Class Marcus Johnson, was assigned to support the 5th Marine Division. On February 19, 1945, the invasion of Iwo Jima began. What was expected to be a quick operation, 5 days to secure the island, according to planners, would stretch into 36 days of brutal combat. The Black Marines of the Ammunition and Depot Companies landed on the beaches of Iwo Jima on the 1st and 2nd days of the invasion. Their mission was to establish supply points, move ammunition from landing craft to inland dumps, and support the combat units pushing inland. They performed these duties under constant enemy fire, crossing the exposed black sand beaches time and again with loads of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies. An intelligence report from February 21, 1945, noted, "Enemy artillery continues to target beach landing areas with precision. Support units sustaining casualties but continuing operations effectively." The report did not specify that many of these support units were composed of Black Marines who were suffering casualties at rates comparable to frontline combat units. On February 23, 1945, a small group of Marines from the 28th Regiment, 5th Marine Division, reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised the American flag. A second, larger flag raising later that day would be captured in the famous photograph by Joe Rosenthal. What is less well known is that while this iconic moment was taking place, Black Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company were delivering critically needed ammunition to units fighting at the base of the mountain. Corporal James Williams, a squad leader in the 8th Ammunition Company, led a team of 6 men carrying machine gun ammunition to a pinned-down company of the 27th Marines. According to after-action testimony from Lieutenant Robert Crawford, Williams and his men made 3 trips across exposed ground under heavy fire. "Without their ammunition delivery," Crawford stated, "my company would have been overrun." Those colored Marines saved at least 40 white Marines that day, and not one of them had to be there. They volunteered when they heard we were in trouble. As the battle for Iwo Jima intensified, the strict segregation that had defined Marine Corps policy began to break down under the pressures of combat. Black Marines from support units increasingly found themselves fighting alongside white Marines, not because of any change in official policy, but because the desperate nature of the battle required every available man. On the night of March 8, 1945, an event occurred that would remain classified until 1963. A Japanese officer leading approximately 30 soldiers infiltrated American lines near the Western Beach, targeting what they believed was a vulnerable supply dump. Instead, they encountered an ammunition distribution point manned by Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company. What happened next is documented in the personal journal of Lieutenant Richard Bennett, a white officer who witnessed the encounter. The Japanese approached the position at approximately 2300 hours. They appeared to hesitate upon discovering the position was manned by Negro Marines. Several of the Japanese officers were heard to laugh, apparently amused that they had encountered what they perceived to be inferior troops. This perception changed rapidly when Sergeant Williams ordered his men to open fire. The resulting engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, 23 Japanese were dead, including 3 officers. The remaining enemy soldiers retreated in disorder. Our casualties were 2 wounded, none killed. The journal entry continues. What I observed that night has forced me to reconsider many long-held beliefs. The Negro Marines fought with a discipline and effectiveness that would have done credit to any unit in the Corps. When I later commended Sergeant Williams, he simply replied, "We're Marines, sir. This is what Marines do." I have submitted a recommendation for commendation for the entire squad, though I doubt it will be approved under current policies. Lieutenant Bennett was correct in his assessment. No official commendation was issued. The incident was classified, ostensibly for security reasons, but more likely to avoid the uncomfortable questions it would raise about the capabilities and proper utilization of Black Marines. Private First Class Marcus Johnson was one of the 2 wounded in the engagement. A Japanese officer had charged his position with a sword, slashing Johnson's arm before Johnson killed him with his sidearm. Johnson's wound was treated at a field hospital, and he returned to duty 3 days later. In a letter to his mother dated March 10, 1945, Johnson made no mention of the engagement or his wound, perhaps aware of military censorship. Instead, he wrote, "The island is almost secured now. They say we'll be moving on soon. The white Marines look at us differently these days. Not friendly exactly, but different. Like they're seeing us for the first time." As the battle for Iwo Jima drew to a close in late March of 1945, the Black Marines of the ammunition and depot companies had proven themselves under fire repeatedly. Official records documented their contributions in the carefully neutral language of military bureaucracy. Support units performed admirably under adverse conditions. What these records did not capture was the profound shift occurring in the attitudes of many white Marines who had witnessed Black Marines in action. Captain Michael Reynolds, a company commander in the 27th Marines, wrote in his official report, "The support provided by attached service units was exemplary and essential to mission success." In his private diary, however, he was more direct. "Those colored Marines from the ammo company saved our bacon more than once. They're Marines, pure and simple and damn good ones. The Corps needs to recognize that. On April 1st, 1945, the invasion of Okinawa began. The Black Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company, the 36th Depot Company, and other service units were again in the thick of the action, supporting what would be the final major battle of the Pacific War. By this time, the rigid segregation that had characterized earlier operations had eroded further. Necessity and experience had begun to overcome prejudice, at least in the combat zones. A report from Brigadier General Thomas Watson, Assistant Division Commander of the 2nd Marine Division, noted, "Integration of Negro personnel with regular combat units has proceeded without significant incident. Combat effectiveness has not been adversely affected, and in some cases has been enhanced by additional manpower." The battle for Okinawa would rage for nearly 3 months, until June 22, 1945. Throughout this period, Black Marines continued to serve primarily in support roles, but increasingly found themselves in combat situations as Japanese forces targeted supply lines and rear areas. Their performance continued to challenge the assumptions upon which Marine Corps' segregation policies had been built. Private First Class Marcus Johnson survived the battle for Okinawa and was with occupation forces when Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. He returned to the United States in November of that year, receiving an honorable discharge in January of 1946. Like many black veterans, he discovered that the country he had fought for was not prepared to recognize his service or grant him the full rights of citizenship. Are you still following along? Help us share this story with more people. Like the video, comment if you were already familiar with this case, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's return to the point where everything changed. "We came back expecting things to be different," Johnson told an interviewer from the Chicago Defender in 1947. "We'd proven ourselves. We'd bled for this country. But when I tried to use the GI Bill to attend college, I found most schools wouldn't accept me. When I applied for jobs, the fact that I'd been a Marine meant nothing if you were colored. It was like the war had never happened." In 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, which mandated equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces. The order led eventually to the full integration of the military. Though the process would take years to complete, the Marine Corps was the last service to fully integrate its ranks. The story of the Black Marines who served in World War II remained largely untold for decades. Official histories mentioned them only in passing, if at all. Their achievements were obscured by the segregation policies under which they served and by the prevailing attitudes of the era. It was not until the 1960s that historians began to document their contributions. In 1965, a Marine Corps historical team led by Colonel James Williams, no relation to Sergeant Howard Williams of the 8th Ammunition Company, began collecting oral histories from surviving Montford Point Marines. The project was prompted in part by the 20-year classification period expiring on certain documents from the war, including the reports on the March 8, 1945 incident on Iwo Jima. Colonel Williams' team interviewed more than 300 former Black Marines, including Marcus Johnson, who by then was working as a postal employee in Detroit. Johnson's interview, conducted on April 12, 1966, contains one of the few first-hand accounts of the nighttime engagement with Japanese officers. "They came up on us in the dark," Johnson recalled. "We could hear them talking in Japanese. Then one of them saw us, saw we were colored, and started laughing. Said something to the others, and they laughed too. I didn't need to understand Japanese to know what they were saying. I'd heard that kind of laugh before, back home." Sergeant Williams gave the order to open fire, and we did. I had a Thompson submachine gun. First time I'd ever fired one in combat. The Japanese officer in front of me drew his sword, his actual sword, and came right at me. I emptied half a magazine into him, but he still managed to slash my arm before he went down. After that, it was over pretty quick. They never expected us to fight like we did. They thought because we were colored, we'd break and run. A lot of people thought that about us. They were all wrong. The story of the Montford Point Marines and their service in the Pacific Theater represents a complex chapter in American military history. These men served a nation and a corps that initially did not want them, under policies that limited their opportunities and denied their capabilities. Yet through their performance under fire, they began to break down the barriers of prejudice and contributed to the eventual integration of the armed forces. In 1965, General Wallace M. Greene, Jr., Commandant of the Marine Corps, issued a statement acknowledging the contributions of the Montford Point Marines. These men served with distinction in an era of prejudice and segregation. Their performance under the most adverse conditions demonstrated the fundamental truth that courage, commitment, and capability know no color. The Marine Corps is a stronger institution because of their service. The statement, while significant, came 20 years after the end of World War II, and long after many of the Montford Point Marines had left the service. For men like Marcus Johnson, official recognition had come too late to influence the course of their post-war lives. Johnson died in 1969, never having received any formal recognition for his actions on Iwo Jima. His family preserved his letters and papers, eventually donating them to the National Museum of the Marine Corps, where they form part of the permanent exhibition on the Montford Point Marines. The night of March 8, 1945, when Japanese officers laughed at black Marines and paid with their lives, remains a little-known episode in the history of the Pacific War. It is a story that challenges comfortable narratives and raises uncomfortable questions about race, courage, and recognition. It is a story that deserves to be told. In the decades since World War II, the Marine Corps has transformed itself from the last military service to accept African Americans to an institution that prides itself on diversity and inclusion. The journey was neither smooth nor swift, and was propelled forward by the examples set by those first black Marines who proved themselves under fire on islands across the Pacific. The legacy of the Montford Point Marines lives on in the men and women who serve today in an integrated Marine Corps. Their story reminds us that courage knows no color, that sacrifice deserves recognition regardless of race, and that the struggle for equality is fought not only in courtrooms and on streets, but also on distant battlefields. As Marcus Johnson wrote in his final letter home, dated August 12, 1945, just days before the Japanese surrender, "Whatever happens next, remember this: we were Marines when it mattered. No one can take that away from us. Not ever." The official records of the United States Marine Corps list 20,000 African Americans who served during World War II. Of these, approximately 12,000 saw service overseas, primarily in the Pacific Theater. They suffered casualties commensurate with their duties, mainly in support roles, but increasingly in combat as the war progressed. Their contributions were essential to American victory, yet for decades remained largely unacknowledged in official histories and public memory. In 1948, as the armed forces began the slow process of integration following President Truman's executive order, a researcher at Marine Corps headquarters began compiling statistics on the service of black Marines during the war. The resulting report, completed in early 1949, was classified confidential and filed away. It would not be declassified until 1967. The report contained a remarkable finding. On Iwo Jima, Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa, the casualty rates for black Marine ammunition and depot companies approached and in some cases exceeded those of white combat units operating in the same areas. This directly contradicted the official narrative that black Marines had served exclusively in support roles, safely behind the lines. An appendix to the report listed specific engagements in which Black Marine units had fought against Japanese forces. Among them was the March 8, 1945 incident on Iwo Jima, described in clinical language. Elements of the 8th Ammunition Company engaged and defeated a Japanese infiltration force consisting of approximately 30 personnel, including 3 officers, near Western Beach Supply Point. Enemy casualties, 23 KIA. Friendly casualties, 2 WIA. What the report did not capture was the human dimension of the encounter, the moment of racial contempt when Japanese officers laughed at finding their path blocked by Black Marines, and the deadly efficiency with which those Marines responded. That story emerged only through the oral histories collected years later, and through private documents like Lieutenant Bennett's journal and Marcus Johnson's letters. In 1967, as part of a broader government initiative to declassify World War II records, the 1949 report became public. Several historians noted its significance, but in an era dominated by the civil rights movement and the escalating Vietnam War, the story of Black Marines in World War II gained little traction in public consciousness. It was not until 1975, with the publication of The Right to Fight, A History of African Americans in the Military by historian Gerald Astor, that the experiences of the Montford Point Marines began to reach a wider audience. Astor's book included a chapter on the March 8th incident, based on interviews with surviving members of the 8th Ammunition Company and previously classified documents. The book prompted renewed interest in the Montford Point Marines and led to additional historical research. In 1978, the Marine Corps Historical Center launched a formal project to document the service of Black Marines in World War II. The project resulted in the publication of The Black Brigade, the Montford Point Marines in World War II in 1982. For the men who had served at Montford Point and in the Pacific, this belated recognition was bittersweet. Many, like Marcus Johnson, had not lived to see their story told. Others had spent decades carrying the memories of their service with little public acknowledgement or recognition. Sergeant Howard Williams, who had led the defense against the Japanese infiltration attempt on March 8, 1945, was interviewed for the Marine Corps Historical Project in 1980. By then 70 years old and living in Philadelphia, Williams reflected on that night on Iwo Jima. "They thought we were a joke," he said. "They saw our faces in the moonlight and started laughing. One of them, an officer with a sword, said something in Japanese. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was the same tone I'd heard all my life from people who thought I was less than them because of the color of my skin. I gave the order to open fire. We had a bar, 2 Thompsons, and the rest of us had M1s. The Japanese didn't even have time to be surprised. They had thought we would run or surrender or panic. Instead, we did what we had been trained to do. We fought as Marines." Afterward, when it was over, a white lieutenant came to our position to see what had happened. He looked at the Japanese bodies, looked at us, and said, "Good work, Marines." Just that, good work, Marines. Not colored boys, or you people, or any of the other terms we were used to hearing. Just Marines. That was the only recognition we got, but coming from him at that moment, it was enough. The story of the Montford Point Marines and their service in the Pacific remains relatively unknown compared to other chapters of World War II history. No major films have told their story, few textbooks mention them, and public commemorations of their service have been limited. Yet their legacy is significant, not only for what they accomplished under fire, but for how their service challenged and ultimately helped to change the racial policies of the Marine Corps and the broader military. In 2011, 66 years after the end of World War II, the United States Congress voted to award the Congressional Gold Medal to the Montford Point Marines in recognition of their service and sacrifice. On June 27, 2012, approximately 400 surviving Montford Point Marines gathered in Washington, D.C. to receive the medal. the highest civilian honor bestowed by Congress. Corporal James Willis, who had served with the 36th Depot Company on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, attended the ceremony at age 87. In an interview afterward, he reflected, "We didn't expect this. We never thought this day would come. We just did our duty. We fought for our country, even when our country wasn't fighting for us. That's what we did. That's who we were. Marines." The story of the night when Japanese officers laughed at black Marines and the deadly consequences that followed encapsulates a larger truth about the Montford Point Marines and their service. They faced prejudice from all sides, from their own military, from their fellow Americans, and even from their enemies. Yet they served with distinction, fought with courage, and through their actions began to change perceptions about what African Americans could accomplish in military service. Their story reminds us that history is often more complex, more nuanced, and more challenging than the simplified narratives we prefer to remember. It reminds us that progress toward equality and justice rarely follows a straight line, and that recognition of service and sacrifice sometimes comes only after decades of silence. Most importantly, it reminds us that courage, commitment, and capability truly do know no color, a lesson written in blood on the black sands of Iwo Jima and the countless other battlefields where Americans of all races fought and died for their country. As we look back on this chapter of our history, we should remember not only the moment when Japanese officers laughed at black Marines, but also the decades-long struggle those same Marines faced for recognition and respect after they returned home. Their battle did not end when the guns fell silent in 1945. In many ways, it had just begun. The full integration of the United States Marine Corps would not be completed until the 1960s, nearly 2 decades after President Truman's executive order. Many of the Montford Point Marines who had proven themselves under fire in World War II continued to serve through this transition, helping to guide the Corps toward a more inclusive future. Today, African Americans serve at all levels of the Marine Corps, including the highest ranks of leadership. The segregated training facility at Montford Point has been renamed Camp Johnson in honor of Sergeant Major Gilbert Hashmark Johnson, one of the first black drill instructors. The story of the Montford Point Marines is taught to all new recruits as part of Marine Corps heritage. Yet the story of that night on Iwo Jima, when Japanese officers laughed at black Marines and paid with their lives, remains largely unknown outside of specialist historical circles. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not only for what it tells us about that specific moment in time, but for what it reveals about the larger struggles for equality and recognition that have shaped our nation's history. In the words of Marcus Johnson, written in his final letter before returning home, "We were Marines when it mattered. No one can take that away from us, not ever." Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, a comment, or a share makes all the difference. If you haven't yet subscribed to our channel, join our community now. I'll see you in the next episode.